Why? Whether we are children or whether we're in old age, we never cease in asking the question, why? It's just part of who we are as human beings. We're always longing to know more. And whether we recognize it, consciously recognize it or not, we desire to go deeper and deeper. We're always asking why. But there's one particular aspect of life that causes this simple question to arise in our minds and hearts continuously. It's the presence of evil, suffering, and death in our world. The reality of suffering and death and evil in our world causes many people to abandon belief and faith in God. You often hear something like this: if God is so good, why is there evil? If God is so good, why is there suffering? If God is so good, why is there death? And these are all good questions to ask. And we should not be afraid to ask these questions. And the scriptures this morning, I think, illuminate for us some very important truths for us to consider as we seek to answer these questions in our own lives. Let's look at that first reading again. We hear from the book of Wisdom, God did not make death, nor does he rejoice in the destruction of the living. For he fashioned all things that they might have being. And the creatures of the world are wholesome, and there is not a destructive drug among them. If there is one thing we can confidently affirm over and over again, is that God is never, ever the cause, the source, the origin of death, evil, or suffering. God cannot do that. And whoever defines their God as someone who can do that, they're worshiping the wrong God, because he's not the right God. And that's not the God, my brothers and sisters, that you and I serve. We affirm with the book of Wisdom that he created all things out of love. He created all things for them to exist, for them to be. He did not create in order to destroy. He does not rejoice in the destruction of the living. Secondly, God's intention, as we see in the book of Wisdom, was for man and woman to live forever. We hear, for God formed man to be imperishable. The image of his own nature, he made him. And so God's original intention, God's original plan for human beings was to live forever. Adam and Eve were created to live forever. Man was never supposed to experience death, suffering, or evil. But in a culture that is secular and godless, I think we just see death as something natural. Suffering and evil are just something that we must endure. And therefore we can never really grasp or understand or totally comprehend their meaning and why they even exist. But our brothers and sisters, there's two things that we can affirm, and I think for us, we should be able to really take this in today, is that God is never the source of evil, suffering, or death, and that we were meant to live forever. So what happened? Why do they exist? Why do we see a world full of all of these things? There are a number of ways to answer and approach this question, but I'd like to take our lead from the first reading today. The book of Wisdom sheds some more light for us with a very simple but profound statement. But by the envy of the devil, death entered the world. As the book of Wisdom reminds us, and as we hear in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, the devil, because of envy, envious of Adam and Eve, and they were made in the image and likeness of God, seduced them to eat of the tree that God told them not to. And they had the freedom. They had the ability to choose, and they chose to go against God and his commandments. And this choice had consequences. The consequence was that harmony with God was shattered. But my brothers and sisters, when that harmony with God is shattered, so are some other things. Harmony with ourselves, harmony with our brothers and sisters, and harmony with creation. It's like a chain link fence. You cut one and all the rest fall. And so, at this point you may ask, then why would God give them freedom? Why would God give them the ability to choose? Or maybe we may go even further. Why does God still give us the ability to choose? Why does God give us freedom? Because only the free can love. If love is forced, it is not love. Love is only possible because we are free to do so. And so often we hear those words that really cause us to question, if God is so good, why is there evil and suffering and death? If God is so good, why would he allow for that to exist? I'd like for us to maybe turn the question around a little bit and for us to ponder this. If God is so good, he wouldn't force us to love him. If God is so good, he wouldn't make us and force us to choose him, to choose to do the good. A good God gives us freedom. A good God gives us the ability to choose him, to love our neighbor, and to do the good. You see, I think that we want our freedom, but we don't want the possibility of its negative consequences. But we can't have one without the other. And God was willing to take the risk of us falling, of us becoming less than who we were, of falling into sin for the sake of love. For the sake of love. And our first parents abused their freedom, and we see its consequences every day, every time we turn on the news. But you see, this new Eve, Mary, this new Adam, Jesus stepped onto the scene and totally changed the way we see freedom. And let's ask this question: what was God's response to our abuse of the gift of freedom? He freely became one of us. He freely gave his life for our salvation. And he shows by his death and resurrection that death, suffering, and evil have no power over him. Let's look at our gospel today. We see the synagogue official whose daughter is fallen to death. And Jesus goes and raises her up, showing that it has no power over him. But let's go even a step further. Is that when Christ comes onto the scene and suffers and dies for you and for me, he shows us that love conquers evil, love conquers suffering, and love conquers death. He gives us the example of freedom used correctly, freedom used rightly, and the power that it has. This week, freedom is going to be the anthem of our country. We're going to see it blasted all over social media, hashtag after hashtag. It's going to be the cry of America this week. Freedom, freedom, freedom. But let us remember the true meaning of freedom. The ability to love God, the ability to choose what is good. And let us not forget just how powerful our freedom is and the gift that it is. Our freedom gives us the ability to love and to do the good. It has the ability for us to be loved. And our freedom also has the potential to cause a lot of evil and suffering. So the question is, which one will you choose?